Hello, my name is Alex Ayala, and some of you may know this, and some of you may not, but I'm a gamer. I love playing video games, and I like watching videos about video games and reading articles about video games. So recently, I came across something that was of particular interest to me. Namely, I recently discovered that the Nintendo 64 game, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, a game about a young fairy boy saving the Kingdom of Hyrule, a game which I have played before, was censored from its Japanese version into its American version to recolor the blood that was in the Japanese version to the color green. Now, why is this? Why are there two different versions? Now, I asked this question and I started thinking, what exactly does video game censorship say about Japanese and American attitudes towards violence? Now, in my research paper, I also talked about sexuality, but for the sake of time today, I'm just going to be talking about violence. I'm sure many of you have heard people say that video games are evil, or that violent video games cause kids to become violent. And it's attitudes like this that have caused some laws to be formed in the past, such as to counter violent video games, such as the Illinois Violent Video Games Law, which restricted the sale of games deemed too violent to minors, or else there was a penalty of $1,000. Now, these attitudes make sense, as there have been some cases of crimes being committed by people who have played video games, who've played violent video games and were known to. One such example is the Columbine High School Massacre, in which 12 students and a teacher were killed by 2 other students who were known to be avid Doom players. Doom is a violent video game from around the 90s. Now, the media has played a big part in making and helping form these attitudes because of the link between the criminals and violent video games. The media automatically started blaming the violent video games for the violent crimes, and as such they've influenced some American attitudes. And because of these attitudes, there have been some research that's been done trying to see the connection between exposure to violent video games and aggression. And what's interesting to note, according to Christopher Ferguson, there hasn't really been much data in support of violent video games causing aggression. In fact, it's kind of been the opposite, with video game sales going up and youth violence going down in past years. But despite this, there have been some people still today who still think that violent video games do cause aggression, showing just how paranoid some Americans are about violent video games. So that makes sense as to why The Legend of Zelda was censored from its Japanese version to America to have the blood recolored. But then why did Japan have the blood in the first place? Why were they okay with it? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. The first is that generally in Japan compared to America, they are more tolerant of graphic violence being shown in their media, particularly film and television. And to illustrate this, I'm going to compare 2 movies, the American movie The Hunger Games and the Japanese movie Battle Royale. Both movies have very similar premises in which kids are forced to fight to the death. Now here's an image of a character, Rue, from The Hunger Games being impaled with a spear. Now, in The Hunger Games, most of the deaths aren't very graphic. Most of them appear off-screen or are too fast to be seen with a good look. Even in this one, when she's impaled, the spear, you don't see the impalation, you just see the spear inside of her. Now compare this to something like this from Battle Royale, in which this character, Megumi, who's one of the students, is slit in the throat by one of her classmates during the survival. And graphic violence like this, it shows that Japan is more tolerant of showing this in their media, and even though it's child violence too. So they're less worried about it. And another reason is that Japanese violent crime rates are much lower than Americans. So as you can see, gun crime and homicide rate are significantly lower in Japan than in America. And what this probably indicates is that the Japanese are probably less worried about their violent crime rates as America is, so they would be less inclined to worry about violent video games influencing these violent crime rates, since they're not that high to begin with, especially compared to America. So Japan is more tolerant of violence in media then, right? Well, actually, when I was doing my research, there has been some contradictions to this, especially with games in recent years. And one such game was the recent game Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes, in which there was a scene where the main protagonist, Solid Snake, has to operate on a woman in order to remove a C4 that's implanted inside of her. And as you can see on the right is more graphic in the United States, where they show the insides of her when she's being operated on, while on the left, in Japan, they pan away from her stomach when she's being operated on. So what's with the inconsistency? Well, I think in the last 15 years, there has been the formation of the CERO in Japan, the Computer Entertainment Rating Organization, which is the Japanese equivalent to America's ESRB, or Entertainment and Software Rating Board, which is responsible for ratings like E and T and M on games. And so in America, there's actually a rating called Adults Only, which is for games that have material suitable for those 18 and up. And Japan has a similar rating called the Z rating for material for 18 years and up. But the big differences between the two are that adults-only games, almost all of the adults-only games that are given this rating, and there aren't very many, are given this rating for graphic sexual content. And even though this says that it includes intense violence in what it considers for adults-only rating, most games that have adults-only ratings aren't rated that way because of their violence. Whereas in Japan, there are a lot more Z-rated games than adults-only rated games in America. And a lot of these Z-rated games are given these ratings for violence as well as sexuality. And the other big difference between the two is that the ESRB is not legally bound in the United States. So you can still technically legal to sell these adult-only games to those under 18, whereas in Japan, the Z rating specifically is legally binding. It is illegal to sell Z-rated games to those under 18. So what this does, effectively, it causes the localization teams and the game developers to have to make some decisions about what they should cut, because if they want to expand their audience to include those like 16-year-olds or 17-year-olds, which most 16-year-olds or 17-year-olds might be interested in these kind of games, they'd have to cut it in some way to get a lower rating so that they could still legally sell to those kids. Now, this rating system has kind of made effectively a role reversal in terms of who is more concerned about violent video games. In the past, like around the time of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, it used to be the America who was more concerned about video game violence, whereas Japan was more lenient about it. Whereas now, because of these new rating systems like the CERO, the Japanese have been more wary about it. So I began this discussion with the question, what exactly does censorship in media and censorship in video games say about the Japanese and American attitudes towards violence in media? Well, in discussing this topic, I hope that it underscores the fact that nothing that's shown in media, edited from media, or removed from media is an accident. There's always a purpose to it, and oftentimes it's because of cultural attitudes. So maybe in the next time when you're watching the next big movie or playing the next cool video game, you might ask yourself or wonder to yourself about these cultural attitudes that may have influenced the creator's decisions in making these. Thank you.